It's a commonly accepted fact that an economic dependence on slavery hindered any efforts to end institutionalized slavery within the antebellum South. The cultivation and expansion of cotton in the early 19th century caused the demand for slaves to boom, further anchoring the peculiar institution in the southern states. Not only were economic concerns a hindrance for Southern abolition, but the very theological philosophy of the great Southern revival of the early 19th century, combined with the geography of the South, served to stifle most efforts at ending slavery. The early historiography of the abolitionist movement that emerged following the Civil War asserted that the South was largely impenetrable for abolitionist ideas. According to historian Stanley Harold, reasons for the success of the abolition movement in the North were in part thanks to developments in abolitionism in the border states from Delaware to Missouri. Beginning in the early 1830s, practices such as paying for seasonal labor and permitting slaves to purchase their freedom from their masters emerged in these states. Strangely, these reforms towards individual liberty and a gradual reduction in slaveholding largely ended below the Virginia state line. In the mid-1700s, the Great Awakening emerged in New England. Greats such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield led congregations in repentance and regeneration. Both George Whitefield and John Wesley preached sermons in southern towns, but the awakening was received differently in the South and the North. Historian John Butler argues that there were in fact two separate revivals that influenced the southern states, and it would not be until the early 1800s that the South would experience its own awakening. The Second Great Awakening, or Great Revival, certainly had an influence on northern abolitionists, but it also had a significant impact on the South, although that impact was significantly different. The nature of the Great Revival in the South differed significantly from that of the North, not only in terms of geography, but in theology. The Great Awakening of the mid-1700s emphasized a return to Calvinist, Puritan beliefs. God orchestrated the events of individuals' lives and entire societies. It was the responsibility of Christians, therefore, to create governments and institutions that mirrored biblical Christianity. In contrast, the Great Revival that encompassed the South was more Arminian in nature, emphasizing the individual's responsibility for his own sanctification. According to Butler, in Enthusiasm Described and Decried, the revivals among English colonists in Virginia also reveal eclectic roots. Presbyterians brought Calvinism to the colony for the first time since the 1650s, but Arminianism underwrote the powerful Methodist awakening in the colony and soon crept into the ranks of the colony's Baptists as well. The American Revolution broke the monopoly of the state-run Anglican Church in Virginia, allowing Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists to take the mantle for expanding the church. According to David T. Bailey in his book Shadow on the Church, 56% of the ministers who served in southern churches were from Virginia, and 80% were from southern states in general. This indicates that the majority theology that would be preached during the Great Revival would be Arminian in nature. Arminian Methodists, Baptists would preach this doctrine throughout the South. But how does free will Arminianism allow for the justification of the institution of slavery, while Calvinist-linked denominations help lead to a vibrant abolitionist movement? The answer may partly lie in the connection between evangelism and education. Many northern clergymen had access to institutions such as Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and others, where they learned the arguments and philosophies of the Enlightenment. The ideal of natural rights and individual liberty were inculcated into theology, and liberty and slaveholding were incompatible. These were, after all, the values that undergirded the American Revolution. The South had few, if any, of these resources. The newly expounding Southwest had virtually none. Therefore, there was little connection to liberation theology of the Enlightenment. Baptist and Methodist preachers were left to their own theological devices. According to John Bowles in the Great Revival, a chief characteristic of revival in the South was the emphasis on individual perfection, not necessarily community improvement. The belief was that if enough individuals in the community became believers, then society itself would eventually be better. This emphasis on Christian perfectionism had some predictable consequences. Individual community churches were seen as the highest authority, the highest religious authority in the South. Although Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians had their own governing bodies, the far-flung pioneer churches may have had little association with them. As a result, the localized rural bodies were free to adapt to the cultural trends of their local communities, including the acceptance of slavery. Although the initial responses to the institution were poignantly against slavery, over time these opinions would change. It seemed that instead of individual righteousness being a catalyst for societal change, the opposite would occur. The sermons of early antebellum preachers came out strongly against slavery. According to the general rules of the Methodist Church, each member is to avoid all kinds of evil and to do no harm, including the buying and selling of slaves. When Francis Asbury preached against slavery in Tennessee, his moral message largely fell on deaf ears. And according to David T. Bailey, although his personal convictions were against slavery, it seems that his priority was to establish churches and convert non-believers, not revolutionize societal institutions. One of the great Presbyterian ministers and politicians of the late 18th century, David Rice, proclaimed in a speech, "A slave claims his freedom. He pleads that he is a man. He was by nature free, that he has not forfeited his freedom nor relinquished it. Now, unless his master can prove that he is not a man, that he was not born free, or that he has forfeited or relinquished his freedom, he must be judged free. The justice of his claim must be acknowledged." One can clearly hear the Enlightenment liberation theology in his message. The sermons from Asbury and Rice reveal that anti-slavery advocates indeed existed in the South prior to secession. But a sharp change in the sermon message begins to take shape in the 1830s. According to Bowles, once external forces threatened the social structures of the South, the role of the churches, which had almost been silent concerning social issues, rose to defend them. Scripture became the defender of institutional slavery, and northern interpretations that advocated abolition were viewed as heresy. It seems that as successive generations of Southern clergy took over, they became ever more influenced by the surrounding slaveholding culture. Their sermons began to defend this broader culture rather than oppose it. According to Baptist preacher Reverend W.T. Hamilton, the existence of slavery in society may, in the view of infinite wisdom, be indispensable to the attainment of the greatest possible good. According to Southern theology, which exalted individual experience yet ignored societal reforms, this was certainly a justifiable conclusion, and Hamilton's message sort of shows this change beginning to take effect. Another example of this shift to slavery's defense can be found in a publication by the Southern Presbyterian Review in 1854, which stated, "Yea, at this moment the South is willing to challenge the whole world to exhibit a laboring class less burdened, better provided for, or who enjoy more real happiness than the Africans who are, in the name of Providence, held by slaves by her laws." This is a powerfully telling statement that not only presents a paternalistic view of slavery, but claims it to be intractable because it is ordained by God. A clear break from Rice's anti-slavery positions of just a few decades earlier. As the Northern Army marched towards Atlanta in 1863, Reverend Stephen Eliot preached about Southern slaves. When were they ever more quiet, more civil, more useful, more contented than they are now? The shift towards defending slavery can clearly be seen. A second cause that limited access to abolitionist messages involved the geography of the South. The gravity model of migration offers a key as to why communication was hindered between North and South. According to the gravity model of migration, interaction between cities are directly proportional to the city's size and distance from each other. In other words, larger, more populous cities interact with each other more more so than smaller cities that are spaced further apart. Small settlements spaced further apart experience a phenomenon called distance decay, in which communication and transportation and trade lag behind. Northern cities had the advantage of being closer together and more populous, thanks to a high birth rate and immigration. Information was able to spread quickly between these rapidly industrialized cities via rail lines and improved infrastructure. Only 100 miles separate New York from Philadelphia, 200 between New York and Boston, and 300 from Boston to Philadelphia by land. The cities in the South were less developed, less populated, and further apart. For instance, there are over 400 miles between Richmond and Charleston, 500 miles from Richmond to Atlanta, and a staggering 700 miles between Richmond and Montgomery, Alabama. Therefore, interactions between southern cities and northern cities, and within or among cities in the South, was slower. Cultural barriers and distance served as an idea buffer. The abolitionist postal campaign of 1835 both represents the completed shift in Southern thought away from abolition and the effects of distance decay. In 1835, a massive propaganda campaign was launched by abolitionists in the North to inundate Southern cities with anti-slavery propaganda. As train cars of leaflets passed the Mason-Dixon line, much of the mail was halted, destroyed, or returned. Scores of anti-abolitionist meetings were held across the South. According to Susan Wiley Jones, unsurprisingly, the majority of the leadership present at these meetings, 94% of them were slaveholders. States that were more economically dependent on institution had more of these anti-abolitionist meetings than the moderate border states. The reliability of mail delivery in the deep South and West was unpredictable and took several weeks for mail to reach its destination. Plenty of time for it to be intercepted and disrupted by antagonists. There's currently little, if any, research performed on the gravity model's application to abolitionism in the antebellum South, and it's an area for future research. Despite the hindrances of a decades-old traditional theology and primitive infrastructure, the South did have its abolitionist champions, such as Cassius Clay, Senator from Kentucky, Thomas Garrett, and the Grimke sisters, South Carolina, all of which either were forced to move north or operate clandestinely from the border states. The legacy of slavery can be a source of shame for many people in the South today, and perhaps they can take pride in the Southern abolitionists, such as the Grimke sisters and Garrett and Cassius Clay, to regain a sense of pride in the South. Thank you for watching. I'm Russ Rose.